So now that we've connected to our database, we're going to actually query the database to retrieve records of our choice. Now we're not going to get too far into SQL in this case, but we are going to do a couple of select statements or queries just to retrieve results that we're after. What we're then going to do is check the number of results that we've been returned, so we can either output that number or just check that we have actually retrieved some results. And then we're going to loop through the results and examine the results in certain ways, so depending on how you need to use the results and output them to your page. And then we'll obviously just output some data to the page as we go, just making sure that we can see that we're actually retrieving the results that we required. So let's go ahead and just start to build up how we might query the database. So I'm going to say results or result equals. Now what we're going to do is access the database object that we've created here or instantiated here, and we're going to use the query method. Now the query method takes a parameter which is an SQL query. So in this case, what we're going to do is select data from our database. We're going to select everything from our database. Now if we do select asterisk from users, this basically means select everything from the users table. So we know that this is our users table. We've got 2 records. So what this is going to do is it's going to select both records, and it's going to select every field from the record, from this record. So it will select ID, first name, last name, bio, and created. So we'll get all of that data back. If we wanted to limit it to a certain amount of results, we could do something like limit 1, or we could also limit it at a certain point in our table by saying something like limit 1, which means limit from 1 and only retrieve 1. So alternatively, if we don't need to retrieve all of the fields from our database, we can define which records that we want to retrieve. So we can say select first name and last name only if we know that we don't need things like the bio, the created date, or the ID. But generally, if you're working with all of your data, an asterisk is absolutely fine. So selecting everything from users, now how do we know that this query has worked or not? Well, we've got 2 ways of doing so. First is to turn off error reporting and just refresh the page. It looks like everything has successfully worked. Let's go ahead and just modify this and see what happens. Nothing. So it looks as though this is sort of silently erroring and we're not actually getting any error back. Now, the reason being for this is that when we actually retrieve our results, we can check things like the number of results, etc., etc. Let's go ahead and use a technique that's extremely useful, and that's to basically print R something and print a result here. So what we're going to do with print R is this will print the sort of structure and datal structure, if you like, of what's returned here. It won't be the result set, but you'll see what we get back here. So let's just print our result. Of course, from people. There we are. So let's refresh. So you can see here that we're returned with a MySQLi result object, and it's got a few bits of information in here that we can sort of look at and work out that this has completed successfully. We've got a field count here, which is 5. We already know that there are 5 fields here, and we also have a num rows, so a number of rows that have been returned, which we know are 2. So if we were to say something like limit 1 or limit 1, 1, we know that that's retrieving the last result, and therefore we'll get a num row of 1. So let's ignore that for now, but let's work out how we might want to actually put this into an if statement. So we want to say if result num rows. So this is basically saying, is this a positive number? If it is, we'll just say, yeah, we've returned some records or something like that. So if we refresh, we get this. Now let's go ahead and select star from users like I mistakenly did before, and we don't get this appear. So we know now that we can check whether this query not was a success or not, but we know that we can get a number of results. Now, if we wanted to actually check if this query had failed or not, we can also do so. And this is extremely important because it allows us to debug a query if it's failed. At the moment, if I was to type in select star from users, we don't get an error back because we're not outputting, specifically asking to output an error. Now, there are a couple of ways of doing this. We can either put or die on the end, and then instead of accessing something like result error, which would probably make a little bit more sense, we're accessing a database error. So it's at a database level. So we're going to say or die, which will kill the page, database error. So we're outputting a database error. So if I refresh now, it says table app.users. So app is the database name, users is the table name, doesn't exist. So it's giving us a readable error that we can see and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Let's go ahead and change this back to people, and it works again. So whatever error that you come across, if you were to type in something that didn't exist, so just type silly there, this doesn't make sense, this query doesn't make sense, so we'll get, oh, okay, fair enough. Let's just type in something like select, like this or something like that. So now when we refresh, we get this actual SQL syntax error, and it will tell us sort of where the error has started, at, so we can sort of debug that a little bit easier. So probably a preferred way is not using or die, because it's not very user friendly in terms of the process of your application. You want to actually do something if this query isn't successful. So what I tend to do is if, like this. And what this is doing is it's encapsulating this assignment to this result variable, but also checking it at the same time. So what we can then do is we can copy and paste our if statement from here, just indent that a little. So what we're now doing is we're saying if this result was a success, and by doing that we're already assigning it to result, then we can check the result num rows, and then we can echo whether it was a success or not. So if I go ahead and refresh, it says yay. If this wasn't successful, so if I remove the asterisk there, that's a syntax error, we now get nothing. So what we could do, I guess, is else and then output our error. So we could do this, die db error, and then we can go ahead and refresh, and then we get the error out there. Or we could just silently kill the page, or we could even just redirect a user, output an error message. It's entirely up to you, but the structure of this is where it makes sense, is just makes it a lot easier to read. So now that we've done this and we've determined that the query was a success and we've retrieved a certain amount of rows, so i.e. a positive number of rows, we can then start to actually loop through our data. So how do we go ahead grabbing our data? There's a few methods that are available to us from this MySQLi result object that's returned. So remember when we did a print r on result, we saw the following. So we got a MySQL result object, and we have like I said, we have a few methods available to us. So let's go ahead and just say rows equals result fetch assoc. Now this stands for Associative Array, which is an array where its keys are associative to the data. So basically when we return this, in fact let's just have a look, it makes a lot more sense. So a numeric array will be 0 indexed and be 0, 1, 2, 3 and have the values bind to them numeric keys. But this will be associative, so it will have names basically, or strings in place. So you can see here that we've got an array, we've got ID, first name, last name. So this is the associative array with the data. Now let's just go ahead and output this a little more friendly way, and that's just wrapping it in pre-formatted tags. And this will basically give us a better view of this. So you'll probably notice that although we're returning 2 results, and we can prove that by echoing result, in fact we could say echo count, and we could even assign this inside of here if we wanted to. So we're echoing the count, and let's just put that in a paragraph tag. This is very messy in terms of markup, but it doesn't really matter at this stage because we're just sort of experimenting. So now it says we've got 2 results, however only one is shown. So that's a little odd when we fetch the results as an associative array, yet we're only being returned with 1 result. Now the reason for this is that we have a fetch assoc or associative array method, but this should now be used within a while loop or whatever loop, really, it doesn't really matter. And because there's a pointer that relates to each record's row. Now what we could do is we could say fetch all instead. So now let's have a look at what that outputs. You can now see that we've got all of the results that have been returned. So we now can see that we can work with this in terms of the 2 results that have been returned. However, you'll also notice that we're now not dealing with an associative array. But what we can do is we can pass through a constant that defines what we are returned with. So this is going to be MySQLi num, which is the default. So if we leave that as it is and refresh, it stays the same. What we can also pass is assoc for an associative array, and that will then change this to an associative array, so we can actually now work with this data. Or we can return both, which I personally have never ever done, but if you do require there be a pointer as well as an associative array or an index like this, or a key like this rather, then you can do. So we just return double the data. Now really that's a sort of waste of resource, so if we just wanted it as an associative array we could do so. Now that we've done that and we've returned as an associative array, we've got a record for each one of these, what we can do is then perform a for each loop, and we could say for each rows as row, echo row. Now what's happening here is we're looping through each of the rows, and they now then for each loop equal or are represented by this row variable. So what we can then do is access the key name or the field name, and then we could perhaps append a break onto the end of this. So what that's now going to do is it's going to output first name and this. So we could of course do something like first name, comma, append a space, and then do row last name. And then when we refresh, we see the first and the last name. So we're extracting this data by looping through using this fetch all method. Now there's another way to do this without having to fetch all. If you were to basically this is a waste of resource if you don't need to work with all of the data. If you just wanted to loop through the data and then break at some point or do something else at some point, you might not want to fetch all immediately. If you had hundreds of records, you might not want to do this. So what we can do is we can take this, we can place this just here, we'll get rid of this, and we'll use the fetch assoc method again. So now what we're doing is for each, oh sorry, no, we're not. We need to change this to a while loop. Get rid of this. And we need to say while row equals result fetch assoc. So we're fetching an associative array, but we're moving the pointer at the same time. So now what's going to happen for each loop, row is then going to represent the record that we're at and give us an associative array back. Then we can access first name and last name. So when we refresh now, we get exactly the same result back. However, you'll notice that the rows, obviously, that's not printing out anything because it doesn't exist. But yeah, that's essentially what we're doing. So we're looping through data in that way. Now, because we're working with an object-oriented extension, MySQLi has object-oriented capabilities, which you can see that we're using here. It's probably a lot better to work with objects rather than associative arrays. So I'm going to say fetch object, and then instead of this kind of notation, this will, if we have error reporting on, this will report an error. So it says fatal error, cannot use object of type standard class, which is just a standard class in PHP, as an array, because we're trying to access array elements of an object. So what we now do is we can just access these as properties. So first name and last name. and indeed any other record as well, so that it doesn't really matter. When we refresh now, we just get this data back. So this looks a lot cleaner. Unfortunately, we can't fetch all results as an object. We have to loop through in this way. But what we've done here is we've achieved looping through result set and outputting what we need. Now, there's a method called free in MySQLi, which basically frees up memory associated with the result set that you've returned back from your MySQL database. And we want to free this up so we sort of clear up after ourselves. The reason being is that now that we've stored the result, we no longer need that result set in memory. So what we do is we just say result, and we use the free method. So now when we refresh, you'll notice that nothing's changed. All we've done is we've freed up the memory associated with the result that we've returned. So in this part, we've looked at querying the database. We've looked at counting the result set, checking that the result, or first of all, checking that the query was successful. We've managed to output how many results have been returned. We've looped through them. We've worked with associative arrays. We've looked at numeric arrays, and we're now working with objects, which is personal preference, myself. And then we've cleared up after ourselves by using MySQL, the free method on the MySQL result object.